It began at 2 in the morning, when the world was supposed to be asleep. In 1631, in the small Irish village of Baltimore, silence shattered into screaming. Doors were kicked in before anyone could pray. Men with unfamiliar faces and stranger tongues flooded the narrow lanes, moving with the certainty of those who had done this many times before. Torches caught thatched roofs. Smoke swallowed the stars. Families were dragged from their beds, half-dressed, barefoot, still tangled in dreams that would never return. By the time the sun rose, Baltimore no longer existed as a village. It existed only as ashes and absence. 237 people were taken that night. Every man, every woman, every child they could carry. Chained in the streets while their homes burned. Then forced onto ships waiting in the dark water. Among them was a young woman named Joan Broadbrook. She had never traveled farther than the neighboring fields. She had never seen the sea except from the shore. She did not know that places like North Africa existed. She did not know that men could come from across the world to claim her body as profit. 3 weeks later, Joan stood on a raised platform in the slave market of Algiers. By then, the shock had turned into something quieter and more dangerous. The screaming had stopped. Fear had settled into her bones. Buyers circled her, the way farmers circled animals at a fair. Hands squeezed her arms, tested her legs, pulled at her hair. Fingers lifted her chin and forced her mouth open to inspect her teeth. She did not understand the language, but she understood the meaning. She was no longer a person. She was merchandise. Joan was sold for the price of 8 oxen, less than a good horse. She would never know that number until later. And even then, she would not fully grasp what it meant. Only that her entire life, every memory she carried from Ireland, was worth less than livestock. She was not alone. Between 1530 and 1780, more than 1 million Europeans were captured and sold into slavery in North Africa and across the Ottoman world. Spanish fishermen, Italian farmers, French sailors, Irish villagers, even people from Iceland, a land so remote that most Europeans themselves could not find it on a map. This is the part of history Europe chose not to remember, because remembering meant admitting that, for 2.5 centuries, the Mediterranean was not a bridge between civilizations, but a hunting ground, and Europeans were the prey. To understand how this was possible, you have to understand who took them. The Barbary pirates were not lawless criminals. They were professionals. They operated from fortified ports in Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Salé. They flew flags, followed orders, paid taxes. The Ottoman Empire supported them directly. Every captive sold meant revenue for local governors and tribute for the Sultan. This was not chaos. It was policy. It was an industry. Their fleets sailed in coordinated formations, sometimes 30 ships moving together. They struck at night or at dawn, when coastal villages were defenseless. They knew exactly what they wanted. Gold and silver were useful, but people were better. A sack of grain fed you once. A human being could be sold, resold, worked, abused, and sold again. To the corsairs, a person was not flesh and fear and memory. A person was a renewable resource. Imagine what that knowledge does to a coastline. From Spain to Italy, from southern France to Ireland, people went to sleep every night listening for sounds that did not belong. Oars in the dark, dogs barking too suddenly. A knock that was not a knock but a boot. Entire villages were abandoned. Families moved inland, leaving fertile fishing grounds behind because the sea had become a door through which nightmares entered. Watchtowers rose along the Mediterranean like a second horizon. Churches installed bells not to call the faithful, but to warn them. A bell ringing at the wrong hour meant run, heed, flee. Sometimes there was time. Often there wasn't. The corsairs adapted. They learned which villages had weak defenses. They bribed criminals for information. They waited for storms, when fishing boats were trapped in harbor and men were home, exhausted, unarmed. Then they struck. In 1627, they reached Iceland. 400 people were taken from a land where winter already felt like a punishment. Imagine an Icelandic farmer waking to men speaking Arabic. Weapons raised, faces foreign beyond comprehension. Men from a continent he could not name, dragging him into a world he could not imagine. In 1544, the corsair Hayreddin Barbarossa attacked the Italian coast and captured 7,000 people in a single summer. 7,000. That is not a raid. That is a harvest. In 1554, the Spanish town of Vieste was emptied in one night. 6,000 captives. An entire community erased before morning. These attacks were not random. They were planned with brutal logic. Young women and children brought the highest prices. Men over 40 were often killed on the spot. Considered useless for labor and unlikely to survive transport, the goal was efficiency, speed, maximum profit before European defenses could respond. And sometimes, the guides were European. Renegades, men who converted, switched sides, and joined the corsairs, became some of the most dangerous figures of all. They spoke European languages. They knew European habits. They knew where people hid their daughters, how long it took for bells to ring, how slow local militias were to gather. The most infamous was Simon the Dancer, a Dutch captain who became one of the richest corsairs in Algiers. He personally captured and sold thousands of his own countrymen. Gold erased nationality. Loyalty ended where profit began. This was the world Joan Broadbrook was dragged into without warning. One moment, her future was harvests, marriage, children who would know her name. The next, she was standing in a marketplace under a foreign sun, stripped of every protection her society had promised her. The shock of enslavement was not only physical, it was existential. Everything familiar became meaningless. The sky was the wrong color. The air smelled different. Even time felt wrong, measured not by church bells or seasons, but by orders barked in a language that sounded like noise. Fear did not fade. It changed shape. It became constant. And Joan's story was only the beginning. Because once captured, survival depended not on innocence or faith, but on where the chains took you next. Some would die before ever seeing land again. Others would live long enough to wish they hadn't. And for the women, especially the young ones, the worst was still ahead. Maria Terralin was 22 years old when her world collapsed at dawn. In 1731, her merchant ship was moving along the Spanish coast when dark shapes rose out of the morning mist. The pirates boarded quickly, efficiently, with no shouting, no drama. This was routine. Men over 40 were separated immediately. Too weak for heavy labor, too risky to transport. Their usefulness ended where the deck met the sea. Maria did not watch them die, but she heard the splashes. She never forgot the sound. The younger men were chained. Every woman was chained. The ship turned south for 17 days. Maria lived in the cargo hold, chained to 40 other women in a space so tight they could not lie down. They sat pressed together in darkness, knees drawn to chests, iron biting into skin with every movement of the ship. There was no light, no fresh air, only the creaking of wood, the slap of waves, and the sound of women crying in languages Maria did not understand. Fear did not need translation. The smell became its own form of torture. Vomit, urino, sweat, blood from shackles that cut deeper each day. The guards opened the hatch only to throw down water and hard bread. Sometimes they forgot. Sometimes they didn't care. Women began to die when one stopped moving. The others had to sit chained to her body until the slavers noticed. Maria counted the splashes when corpses were dragged up and thrown into the sea. 7 splashes. 7 women erased between Spain and Africa. One woman beside her stopped eating on the 3rd day, stopped drinking on the 5th. By the 8th day, she was dead. Maria remained chained to her for hours, the body growing colder, heavier, before it was removed. When the hatch finally opened for the last time, sunlight stabbed into Maria's eyes like knives. She had not seen the sky in over 2 weeks. As her vision cleared, she saw the white walls of Algiers rising from the shore, beautiful, almost peaceful. Then she saw the slave market. The system that processed human beings there was brutally refined. Captives were taken first to public baths, not out of mercy, but preservation. Wounds were cleaned just enough to prevent infection. Bruises were hidden with oils. Broken bodies were made presentable. A dead slave was a financial loss. Then came sorting. Strong young men were sent to construction sites or the galleys. Life expectancy there was short, chained to oars, unable to stand or stretch, fed just enough to keep rowing. Most died within 5 years. Educated men, those who could read, calculate, speak multiple languages, were more valuable. Tutors, clerks, craftsmen, still property. But property worth maintaining, children were the easiest to break. They learned new names, new prayers, new languages quickly. Many were converted and raised in households where their past became a rumor, then nothing at all. They would grow up never knowing where they came from, never knowing who they had been. Women were divided by age. Those over 35 were sent into domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, endless work that kept households running and left no trace. But women between 15 and 30 were the most valuable commodity in the entire market. They were destined for harems. Before sale came inspection. Women were taken onto raised platforms in the center of the market. Buyers walked around them slowly, deliberately. Hands squeezed arms and thighs to test strength. Fingers pulled, mouths open to examine teeth. Eyes searched skin for scars, blemishes, signs of disease. In many markets, especially in Algiers and Tunis, nothing was hidden. Women were put fully on display. Buyers touched whatever they wanted to touch, publicly, casually. Legally, resistance was punished immediately. A slap, a fist, a whip. The lesson was simple and effective. You are not here to consent. You are here to be evaluated. A French friar named Pierre Don witnessed these markets in 1634 while working to ransom Christian captives. He wrote that women were examined like animals in public squares, touched everywhere to verify their health. The young women cried. The crowds watched. This was not secret. It was not shameful. It was normal. Now imagine Joan Broadbrooke standing on that platform, a young woman from a tiny Irish village where she had known every face since childhood, where touch outside marriage was scandal, where her biggest fear had once been a failed harvest. Now strangers examined her body, spoke over her head, debated her value in a language she could not understand. Her name meant nothing. Her past meant nothing. She was sold to a Turkish merchant named Ahmed for the price of 8 oxen. From Algiers, Joan was sent east. The journey to Istanbul took 6 weeks. She traveled in another ship's hold, this time with 20 European women, Italian, Spanish, French, Greek. None spoke English. Words were useless. Fear was shared easily. The women who had survived longer tried to explain what awaited them using gestures, expressions, broken phrases, hands mimed acts words could not carry. Joan understood enough. When they arrived, they were taken directly to Ahmed's house. The first thing the other slaves did was strip Joan of her clothes. The dress she had worn since Ireland, already torn and filthy, was taken outside and burned. Everything from her old life vanished into smoke. Then they bathed her in perfume water, scrubbed her skin, combed her hair. She was dressed in Ottoman clothing and jewelry she did not recognize. When she looked at her reflection, she did not recognize herself. That night, Ahmed came to her room. Joan had never been with a man. In her world, intimacy followed marriage, choice, consent. This was none of those things. Ahmed did not speak English. He did not need to. Years later, Joan managed to send a letter back to Ireland, one of the only first-hand accounts we have from an Irish woman taken into Ottoman captivity. She wrote that she could not describe what she suffered that first night, only that she wished for death 1,000 times. But death did not come, and every night after was the same. This was the reality of the harem, not silk cushions and romantic intrigue, not the fantasy painted by European artists who had never seen the inside of one. It was captivity, forced submission, survival, and the slow psychological torture of knowing this was not temporary. There was no rescue coming. No army was marching for them. Home was not waiting. Some women broke quickly. They screamed at walls, spoke to people who were not there. Other slaves restrained them until exhaustion silenced them. Those who could not be controlled were sold again, or simply disappeared. Others learned to survive by shrinking inward. They created routines, remembered songs from childhood, repeated prayers in their heads, clung to memories of rain on familiar roofs, of food cooked by mothers long dead or too far away to save them. Most went numb. It hurt less that way, because what came after capture was not one trauma, but a lifetime of them, and every day. Survival meant learning how to disappear without dying. For an enslaved woman, survival did not mean safety. It meant endurance. Daily life depended entirely on who owned her, but the rules that governed her existence were universal. First came pressure to convert. Conversion did not bring freedom. It changed nothing about legal status. A converted woman remained property, but it could soften punishments, earn slightly better food, slightly less violence. Those who resisted were beaten, starved, locked in dark rooms for weeks at a time until resistance collapsed, or the body did. Second came language. European women were forced to learn Turkish or Arabic. Those who learned quickly were seen as useful. Those who struggled were labeled stubborn, rebellious, and punished accordingly. Language was not taught as a skill. It was enforced as submission. And above all, no European slave had legal rights. She could not testify in court. She could not own property. She could not refuse her owner. She could not leave the house without permission. In law, She was not a person. She was an object, as replaceable as furniture. Most women ended up in one of three fates. The first was brutal domestic labor. Cooking, cleaning, childcare. 16-hour days with no rest. Punishments for mistakes were immediate and disproportionate. Burned food could mean a beating. A broken dish could mean days without food. These women aged quickly. When they became too weak to work, they were sold to poorer buyers or simply abandoned in the streets. The second was concubinage. If a woman was young and attractive, her owner used her whenever he wished. In wealthy households, multiple concubines lived under the same roof, competing for attention because attention meant protection. A woman who gave birth to a son gained status. She might earn small freedoms. Daughters were worth less. Too many disappointments meant demotion, resale, or disappearance. The third was resale. Many women were sold 5, 6, even 10 times in their lives. Each sale meant a new public inspection, a new owner, new rules, new dangers. Each time, survival began again from nothing. But there was one destination feared above all others: the imperial harem of the Ottoman Sultan. The harem was not a single room or even a single building. It was a vast complex within Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. Over 400 rooms, courtyards, baths, kitchens, gardens. At its height, between 500 and 1,000 women lived there at any given time. A city of women behind walls, all of them property. Most were not European. The majority were Circassian and Georgian slaves from the Caucasus, considered the most beautiful by Ottoman standards. Europeans were rare, valuable, and carefully selected. To reach the imperial harem, a slave had to be extraordinarily young, often between 12 and 18, physically flawless, and resilient enough to survive layers of evaluation. The Sultan's agents scoured slave markets across the empire. The most promising girls were purchased and brought to the palace for further inspection. Physical examinations that made public markets seem gentle. Tests of intelligence, temperament, obedience, health. Most failed and were sold elsewhere. Only a fraction remained. Inside, training began, years of it. Girls learned Turkish, etiquette, music, dance, embroidery, calligraphy. They were taught how to walk, how to sit, how to speak, how to look at a man, and how to look away. Their individuality was refined out of them. The goal was not happiness. It was perfection. But here is the truth that destroys every romantic fantasy about the harem. Of the hundreds of women inside, only a small number, perhaps 50 to 100, would ever see the Sultan in person. Of those, maybe 5 or 10 in an entire generation would actually share his bed. The rest lived in permanent suspension. Not free, not chosen. Waiting. Years passed. Beauty faded. Hope thinned. When a sultan died, any woman who had not given him a child was transferred to the old palace, a separate complex where she would live out her life in deeper isolation. No marriage, no children, no leaving, just existence until death. Ottoman records mention a European woman known only as Francesca. She entered the harem in 1650 at 15 years old. She died there in 1702 at 67, 52 years inside those walls. She never saw the Sultan, not once, when she died. She was buried in a cemetery for palace slaves. No name, only a number, slave 847, origin, Franco, status, deceased. So, why did Europe allow this to continue for 250 years? Because Europe was divided. Religious wars between Catholics and Protestants consumed resources and attention. Cooperation against the Corsairs was impossible when nations were busy destroying each other. Some states, like France and Venice, maintained profitable trade agreements with the Ottoman Empire. They did not want to risk commerce over captured fishermen and peasants. And some Europeans benefited. Renegades grew rich. Merchants traded freely with North Africa. Indifferent to where goods and people came from, ransoming captives became an industry of its own. But it favored the wealthy. A merchant's daughter might be freed in a year. A fisherman's wife might wait forever. Maria Tiralin was one of the rare exceptions. After 8 years in captivity, her family sold everything they owned to raise her ransom. 200 Dutch florins, a fortune. She returned home in 1739 and found nothing waiting for her. Her fiancé had married another woman. Her mother had died of grief. Her father was ruined. Her community rejected her. She was seen as contaminated, dishonored. In her diary, Maria wrote that she would have preferred to die in captivity. At least there, Her shame was private. At home, it was permanent. The system only ended in the 19th century, when European powers finally acted. In 1830, France invaded Algeria and dismantled the Corsair strongholds. By then, more than 1 million Europeans had been taken. Most never returned. Joan Broadbrooke survived years in captivity. When she was finally freed, she tried to return to Ireland. Baltimore was gone. Her family was gone. For decades, her name was read aloud in church during prayers for captives. Every Sunday, spoken into silence. Eventually, they stopped reading it. She was forgotten. This is not just the story of Joan, or Maria, or Francesca. It is the story of over 1 million lives erased by a system of human trafficking that operated openly for centuries. The coasts of Ireland still remember the night of 1631. The archives of Istanbul still hold the numbers. And now, so do you